By 1984, the labor movement was in retreat, with union membership in decline for the first time in half a century, an aggressively anti-union conservative government having won a second general election. In March 1984, when there were 170 working collieries in Britain employing more than 190,000 people, Arthur Scargill, the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, obtained a hit list of mines that the Thatcher government was planning to close. The ensuing strike against job losses, for which the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, controversially never held a national ballot among its members for, pitted striking miners against Mrs. Thatcher's government, the police, and other miners, and led to divisions and families which remain to this day. Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, LGSM, was formed after two men, Mark Ashton and Mike Jackson, began collecting donations for the miners at the 1984 Lesbian and Gay Pride March. The organization maintained weekly meetings for the next year, raised money for the miners, and was involved in demonstrations, visits, and conferences. Margaret Thatcher believed that she needed to meet this conflict with strength, and she was not interested in being soft with the miners, as reported in the movie adaptation Pride. The British government was determined to break the strike and bring the miners back to work. Arthur Scargill was determined that the only result he would accept was that only pits which had no mineable coal left would be closed. The government entered the conflict prepared, used the rhetoric of right to work and economic rationality, and coupled that with demonizing Arthur Scargill to gain public support and demoralize the miners. Thatcher also used the NUM's lack of a ballot effectively as part of her right to work rhetoric. The argument was that every individual should have the fundamental right to choose whether or not they wish to work, and bypassing a ballot meant the NUM had taken this right away. Although he was popular among the miners, Thatcher portrayed Scargill as a revolutionary, militant Marxist who ruled the NUM like a dictator. Scargill also knew the importance of television as a means of appearing before the NUM membership and the public as a whole. He made perceptibly timed appearances throughout the dispute, yet he continually accused the BBC of distorted coverage, particularly concerning the picket line violence. Scargill found it impossible to delegate any of his responsibilities as official spokesperson for the NUM, and there was no overall communication strategy. His technique was very one-dimensional. The LGSM communicated a message of solidarity in which they had common interests with the miners. They recognized similar experiences of police violence, media distortion, and they opposed the British government as well. However, it should be noted that the LGSM did not want to seem entirely outside the labor movement. They wanted to be identified with it. Groups such as the Black Delegation and LGSM wanted to be a part of an attempt to broaden the labor movement, not bypass it completely. I would identify the communication models as a mix of transmission approach and the transactional approach between the three groups. Each group was trying to communicate through the noise of the political environment and the media. The media coverage was a barrier to communication at the time, as messages became distorted and vilified on the side of the miners and LGSM. In addition, the interests at the core of the conflict were a barrier to communication. Documentation at present day shows that Thatcher was likely not going to give in to any of the demands of the miners. She was set to close the mines and crush the union at any cost, which means that the communication taking place was not going to end in a compromise or concession of any kind on the part of the government. This was a conflict of ideology, and if Scargill thought it was simply about job protection, he would have been mistaken. It was about the power trade unions held in Britain at the time. Cabinet papers released in August 2013 reveal Thatcher's long-held ambitions to quote-unquote crush the power of Britain's trade unions. Her government believed that they had a mandate of the people to enforce market values on national industries and to curb union power, which they thought had been responsible for Britain's post-war economic decline. The conflict between the miners and LGSM was largely about whether or not the miners wanted to accept support and solidarity from the group. The LGBTQ community was attacked and demonized in the greater community, and union leadership was worried about the messaging that could possibly lower public support, especially when the majority of the public believed that the miners should return to work. The LGSM faced internal conflicts as well. At a time when many gay men were dying of AIDS, many people within the LGBTQ community thought there were more pressing issues to contend with than showing solidarity with the miners. In addition, there was a general perception that the miners were homophobic, and some members of the activist LGBTQ community had experienced this firsthand. So this caused conflict about whether or not to focus time and resources on to support their cause. Neither the Thatcher government nor the miners entered into negotiations ready to back down or concede. The government appeared to be the main source of escalation, with the miners bracing through each tactic thrown at them. Thatcher was not afraid to employ the use of the police and did so liberally at times. There are those that criticize the government's handling of the strike as being ruthless and cruel because many miners and their families suffered during the strike. Intrastate violence is the most common form of conflict today, and it describes sustained political violence that takes place between armed groups representing the state and one or more non-state groups. In this case, the clashes between the miners and the police could have been considered intrastate violence. Besides this, the government planned to wait it out, to starve the miners back to work, which is why the collection of money the LGSM organized was so important to support the miners. In the end, the government's escalation did end up bringing the conflict to resolution. The government incorporated revoking benefits from those who were dependent on the strikers to their strategy through Section 2, Clause 6 of the 1980 Social Security Act. This law provided a highly effective aspect of the government's handling of the 1984-85 strike, as it made life extremely difficult for the miners and their families, contributing to their eventual return to work. Ultimately, the government's careful tactical planning and escalation did bring the miners back to work and weaken the labor unions. However, emotional resolution never came. There was deep divides between families and neighbors, as well as mining communities' perception of Thatcher and the conservative government. There still remains great animosity toward Thatcher and parts of the mining community who are still alive today. As for the miners and LGSM, the miners led the Pride Parade in 1985 as they had pledged solidarity with the LGBTQ community due to the support they received throughout the strike. These two communities, with seemingly different situations and goals, had found common interests in the labor movement and in opposition to groups oppressing and demonizing them. This left a lasting impact on the labor movement, organizing, and Britain as a whole. The central interest of LGSM was that if lesbians and gay men offered solidarity with the miners and their communities, this support would be reciprocated. LGSM sought to highlight the common interests of the miners and lesbian and gay people. LGSM's attempt to create a new way of relating partly relied on the appeal to likeness. While the solidarity of many other groups was based on common interests of the working class, LGSM had to take a different approach. By providing an understanding of oppression that highlighted the commonality of experience between the mining and the lesbian and gay communities, they sought to undermine divisions between class and sexuality-based politics. This also highlighted the plights of the working class lesbian and gay people. While many LGBTQ people of the time moved to London, this was largely a middle-class scene. Bringing the miners' strike into popular gay and lesbian circles sought to challenge this. The miners' stated position was saving mining jobs. However, there were interests wrapped up in cultural identity that was tied to the mines. In addition, holding on to political power was likely an interest involved. Pride, a cinematic representation of this historical event, stated, "The pit and the people are one and the same." Therefore, not all interests were described by the stated position. The government's interests were rooted in a motivation to limit the power of labor unions. Thatcher was quoted as saying she wished to crush the power of the trade union. However, Thatcher communicated that it was the belief in the right to work and an economic rationale that propelled the government forward in this conflict. Thatcher used the position that keeping the coal pits open was not economically beneficial to society and therefore not moral. She explained that the plan to close the pits was necessary in compliance with the law of the market because the coal industry was in decline. The miners were asking for something that, quote unquote, could not be conceded because conceding would mean taking money from elsewhere. Therefore, the position did not represent the underlying interests 100% accurately. The strike began to fall apart in the early months of 1985, with miners in many regions reluctantly returning to work. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, and most families were unable to afford heating as the NUM's funds had been seized by the government in October, and miners were unable to claim state benefits because the action had been declared illegal. By early March 1985, 60% of the miners were still on strike across the country, compared with 74% at the same time the previous year. A ballot was taken on March 3rd, and by a tiny majority, the miners decided to return to work, defeated without a new agreement with management. It seems clear that distributive negotiation tactics were applied. Specifically, power was applied to wrest concessions from other parties. This conflict was openly hostile and adversarial. The miner situation became so dire, many had no option but to return to work, and there was no agreement between the government and the workers. The LGSM intervened to provide monetary support and solidarity to the miners, but in the end, Thatcher's impeccable planning and messaging campaign ended the strike in the government's favor. It seems clear that the government had impeccable planning and strategizing for the pit closure and the strike. This party had no intention of conceding to the demands of the miners and were willing to wait them out, with media portraying the miners' leadership as leftist radicals and the public opinion widely believing the miners should get back to work. There was little reason for the government to engage in any negotiation, considering the interests underlining their position was to undermine the authority and power of the union. Reporting and analysis after has come out that has come out after 1984 and 1985 determined that Arthur Scargill, the NUM president, was not nearly as prepared for the strike and the government media campaign as Thatcher was. There did not seem to be a cohesive intervention strategy on the part of the coal miners' union. They were simply reacting to the escalation of the government. In each of these cases, I found no evidence of or direct reporting that suggests there was mediation or ongoing negotiation. However, it appears that both sides were using tactical utility of refusing to engage in direct communication. The LGSM intervened by trying to provide monetary support and solidarity with the miners. This support allowed the miners to continue to pursue their interests for a longer period of time. However, the money they raised was no match for the government escalation, which took place in the legal system along with the force of the police.